webinar. I'm not sure who's online yet. We're a little bit early, but if you are there and can see me live, please try out the chat function, which is in the right-hand side of your screen. There's a message function at the bottom of the screen on the right. It'll only display your Christian name if you type something in, but while we're waiting for the actual formal start of the webinar, if some of you could just indicate that you're there and present, it would at least give me some encouragement to continue, and perhaps say where you're from or what the weather's like or whatever you like, and we'll just watch the screen until we start formally at 3 p.m. So I'll keep an eye off to my left here on the screen to my left to see what chat is coming in, if any, and acknowledge them if I can. And also, it's worthwhile remembering that during the course of the webinar, you can't talk to me directly, although the webinar software does permit that function. At the moment, I'm not really competent or confident enough to engage in that, I'm afraid. So what I'm asking you to do is to simply type a question in the chat function, and I will look from time to time over to my left and see what is coming up and respond to them orally on air, so to speak. Now, if some of you are uncomfortable with that and you want to ask a private question, well, you can do that as well, or you can simply hang around until after the webinar and we will deal with questions that might have arisen and you didn't actually ask during the webinar at that time, or of course after the whole event is finished, and you can contact me by email or by phone. I'm more than happy to chat at that point. So at this stage, we're just waiting for people to log on at the formal start at 3 p.m. So you can talk amongst yourselves at the moment until we're ready, but the time is rapidly approaching as my clock indicates. But I'll just check on the chat at the moment and just see what's going on. Okay, so I was just saying to those who are perhaps just coming online now, if you could type in on the chat bar at the bottom of the screen something to indicate that who it is and where you're from, and we'll start the seminar formally at 3 p.m. We've got a couple of minutes to go, and we need to give people time to log on, particularly if that happens to be their first webinar. And for me, this is only the third occasion I've done it, other than ones presented for Legal Wise and some of my competitors, as it were, who are beginning to film them as well. So that they do have their challenges, but I think it's a very useful environment to get in contact with as many of you as possible and as cheaply as possible without charging an enormous amount up front. So at 2:59, and some of you have come back and indicated you're there, which is, again, reassuring. Thank you. Just looking at the names there, we've got 5 or 6 coming up now, which is great. Thank you very much. I'm glad to see that you've come through okay. And for those that cannot hear, please say if the volume needs to be turned up a bit, or I'm continually obstructing the screen, which I'll try to avoid as we go along. But it's 3 o'clock now. Just one thing I've got to mention, one of you have already done it. There is a provision within the chat to, as it were, ask to speak. Now, that is a function that is available, but I'd ask you not to use it at the moment because I simply can't cope with multiple requests to speak. So I do ask you, if you've got a question, just type the question. I will pause during the webinar and take questions or invite questions, and I'll attempt to answer them online as best I can, but I can't really engage you orally, as it were, much as I'd like to, and maybe in my next webinar I'll get better at doing that. But right now, only typewritten chat, and the chat box on the right-hand bottom of the screen for those that have just logged on. And I think at least in one case, one firm has 4 or 5 people present. I hope that that's all working for you. I think you're in your library or in your boardroom, so welcome and thank you for registering. I hope that the content's of use to not only you but all the participants, because it's a passionate topic for me, one that's driven my professional life for some years. So I'll just pause for a moment now and get formally started in about 10 seconds. Okay, so this is about planning. As I said, it's a topic that's dear to my heart. Why? Well, for many, many years, I've been the managing partner of one of the biggest firms in Australia. It had 9 offices across 3 different continents, and back in the 90s and early 2000s, before I retired as the managing partner, we made quite a deal of effort in attempting to get partners to plan, to get individuals to develop their career plans as well as their marketing plans, their business plans, call it what you like. And I learned a lot in that process. There were 200 odd partners in that organisation, so you can imagine that was quite a big client to have in the short sense of the term. But more importantly, I think it was a real eye-opener as to what it was that contributed to individual, not only practice groups, but individual teams. And I do reflect not only on that large term experience, but also on the small term and the small firm experience, because my first job as a managing partner back in the 80s was with a 6-partner firm, and I'd been there since the firm had only had 2 partners, and I made the somewhat early mistake, some would say, of becoming the managing partner, and thus got involved not only in the large firm environment subsequently, but also in the small firm environment. So I've seen it both at that scale and at the larger scale, and it's left me with a very firm view that planning is a critically important skill to cultivate. It's basically a skill that you can't afford not to acquire. A lot of people say, oh, I haven't got the time, I don't know what I would put in the plan. Well, obviously we're going to try and address those questions today. But I do want to just set the scene by emphasising, if you like, the one point that I'd really like you to take away from this particular webinar, and that is that it's a skill that is just so critical that you need to understand why it is that so many of us don't do it, or don't do it well, or shy away from it. In other words, it's a self-management tool, it's a personal growth process, and it's there to help you create or manage change. Now, we all know change, it never stops. And I can assure you, over the 30 odd years of my career, that's certainly been the case. And it's going to be an ongoing process for all the rest of you, I have no doubt. So planning is a way in which you learn to either create that change, if you really want to be at the cutting edge of innovation and new ways of doing business, to manage change if you're creating some change but simply having to deal with others rather willfully or unwillingly, as it were. And the alternative is what? To become a victim of it. So, as I say, the big message is that you need to develop the planning muscle, if you like, in order to do one of those things: create it, manage it, or simply become a victim of it. And I fear to say that a lot of the partners that I've seen over the years have become victims of change when the mouse moved their cheese, as it were, and they were left without this fundamental skill of learning how to adapt. But having said that, I want to just change the slide, hopefully, which at the moment it's not wanting to do. So just bear with me 1 second while I just activate that slide changing mechanism. Now, the best laid plans of mice and men. But the quote from Winston Churchill, plans are worthless, but planning is everything. Now, that might seem a rather disingenuous comment, but it does encapsulate a lot of wisdom. And the wisdom is this, that it's the process that's important. It's not that the plan that you might eventually commit to paper, that you'll commence to try and create, will answer all your issues, will satisfy all your critics, particularly your internal critic, as it were. It's all about the process you engage in whilst you create a plan, acknowledging and admitting that at the end of the day, no matter how much time and effort you've put into that initial plan, it's going to change. It's going to adapt. That saying from Sun Tzu about no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy is literally true. You can amend it so that you say that no marketing or business plan survives first contact with the clients. And that's true too. So what got me interested in this particularly, other than my background in being a managing partner and being a solicitor and before that a barrister, it was really brought to a head most recently when I wrote a book about innovation. It's called Lean Innovation for Lawyers and published out of London at the end of last year. And in order to research that book, I travelled into Europe, into the UK, into the US, and of course around Australia, talking to a lot of firms who were attempting to be at or near the cutting edge of innovation. And it wasn't just in the legal field, it was in many fields, those that were innovating in the startup space. And a lot of my initial clients, my background in intellectual property, brought me into contact with people who are at that cutting edge. And I was struck immediately by how keen they were on planning as a process. They were readily acknowledging that their initial plan looked nothing like what they eventually did. And some of you may have heard that term, pivoting, that they started with one thing in mind and progressed to another. But all along the way, they engaged in the task of planning, revising, and changing in order to adapt or to recognise that some of their assumptions were wrong. And so it was the process that was important. It wasn't that if you look back at the original plan, boy, they got it so right so early. Now, obviously, from time to time, somebody does pick a winner, somebody does anticipate that there'll be a growth in a certain area and literally hit the cue ball right in the hole. But that's the rare event. Much more likely, you start with a vague idea, you do your research, you document it to some extent, and then you adapt. So let's just set the scene a bit before we take that thought much further, and that is that we really need to look at what the current realities are. What are the current realities? We talked about change already. Planning is about managing change. I've mentioned that. The need to plan because you need to able to develop this ability to either create, manage, or at worst become a victim, as it were. Two other words that commonly occur: building resilience, or as Nicholas Taleb, the author of Black Swan, has said, creating this state of anti-fragility. If you're strong and rigid, then you have a discouraging event, you're likely to break. We're all familiar with depression, we're all familiar with people who lose the plot, as it were, and quite often that is simply a characteristic of those that don't take the time to plan, assume that things will continue as they are, and then when they don't, they've got no ability to manage, adapt, change, react. They haven't honed that skill. So again, the message is that if you want to develop that resilience, that ability to move in the wind like the proverbial bamboo to changes in wind and climate, then you need to have this planning muscle well developed. The one that struck me from the startup and the innovators themselves is this business about learning what you need to learn about the environment and learning, most importantly, what you need to know about yourself. It's your internal dialogue that in many cases prevents you from taking that initial step. It's your self-doubt, it's your lack of confidence. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a moment, but there are several things that current realities demand, and that is that you've got to embark on this sort of lifelong learning process. Learning is about trying, experiment, failing, testing your assumptions. And really, when you think about it, that's what planning is all about. In other words, you sit down, you think about something you want to have an impact on, you want to drive a change, you want to make either it might be a small change, it might be a big change, it might be something personal, it might be something career orientated. The skills are the same. Very transportable planning, projects. I recently embarked on a 4 or 5 year project which came to a conclusion about 3 years ago when I sold a boat that I had locally here, embarked on this project of buying a boat in Europe to sail the canals. I'm happy to say that I've got a boat over there now, that I am sailing the canals. It's one of my bucket list ambitions. It was a planning process. When I started, I knew nothing about the canals. I knew something about sailing. And this is a plan that's come to fruition, very much a personal plan, but I use the same approach, the same skills that I'm going to advocate in this webinar today. So a couple of other final things on the distraction point here, that we're all the time concerned about understanding what we're good at, what we should delegate, what we should focus on, and you've got to manage the distractions. And again, planning is a process which enables you to do all of those things, because they are very much the nature of the environment that we all work in, whether it's in a law office or elsewhere. There are multiple distractions. You need something which is going to bring you back to where you were, what you're trying to achieve. And having a plan and having a process involved in managing that plan is just so critical. So this little graphic emphasizes a point that's dear to my heart, because it struck me as, why is it that when there's an overwhelming amount of evidence that planning can be so helpful, that planning can result in real change, that most of the outstanding success stories that you're confronted with are inveterate planners, why is it that more of us don't do it? And I've seen this so much in the last 10 odd years while I've been consulting to law firms and other firms, and it's all about self-doubt and fear. Seth Godin, you might have struck his writing, Guerrilla Marketing and what have you, Godin, I highly recommend his work, talks about our lizard brain, and talks about the flight and fight response, talks about the lizard brain as being basically something that drives you to be hungry, scared, angry, and horny. And it's that primitive lizard-like brain that cuts in when we attempt to do something difficult, something that presents a challenge, something that worries you. And amongst others, you get people like Tim Ferriss, for instance, the author of the 4-Hour Work Week, again, whose work and blog and the like I highly commend. It talks about the success stories in this world being related to those who are prepared to confront difficult situations. That if you've got a to-do list and you don't know what to do, chances are the thing that frightens you most is probably what you should be doing, because that will build that resilience and that planning muscle that I've been talking about. But failure and anxiety about planning and getting started on a planning process is inevitably related to this. As I say, when I go out and talk to firms, what I find is that there are lots of plans. So some of them are literally years old and they've never been executed. They've never taken the step beyond merely the documentation. They haven't gone into that secondary step of actually trying to make the plan live. So planning is about not only taking that first step, overcoming this internal self-doubt, the lack of confidence that you may have that it's going to succeed, but also the process that you embark on after you've made that initial documentation. And the tool I'm going to commend to you is precisely one that encourages you to do that. So why is it that lawyers particularly, I think, are so frightened? And it is a word that I use advisedly, frightened about planning. Well, you think about it. In order to become a lawyer, you need to do pretty damn well at university these days. There's no two ways about it. As I used to say to a lot of the first-year intakes when I was addressing them in the larger firm, I doubt that my particular scholastic achievements would enable me to get in the door of this particular firm at that stage. They all had better entry scores than I did. But we're used to succeeding. We've got to where we've got relying on our own abilities, number one. And number two, we get things right. We know how to pass exams. What we don't know what to do and how to do is to manage apparent failure, how to overcome a lack of confidence in an area where you haven't had any formal training, where the amygdala cuts in and you just get frightened and scared. And you're holding yourself out. You're publishing in a plan quite often in a public way, firstly to yourself and secondly to those that you work with. You're publishing an ambition and something that might be very personal to you. You want to build a practice in China. You want to open an office in San Francisco. You want to build the business so that you employ 5 or 10 people. There could be a whole raft of ambitions that you have, but actually putting it down on paper requires you to confront that ambition. And many people just won't do that. They just won't fess up, firstly to themselves, let alone engage others in the process. So it's, as it were, it's a stumbling block that's really, if you like, has a gestation internally with that internal dialogue. And then just as critically, even if you overcome that internal resistance, You then engaged in an external dialogue. In other words, you're likely to have to engage in those that you work with, or those that you employ, or those that you report to, your team leader, the senior partner, the person from whom you're trying to extract the marketing budget, or something similar. So there's that internal dialogue to start with, that you're challenging yourself to achieve a certain objective or a series of objectives, and then having done that, you're then going to publish it, as it were, engage others, not only because you want to, but because probably you need to. Life is a team sport. You don't get away with much in the law by being a solo operator these times. It doesn't mean to say you have to have an employee or employees, but generally it's a team sport. You'll be working with people in your team, you're delegating work. You need to find out in the planning process what you're good at, what you should do, what you shouldn't do, that question of focus. And you need to be able to engage others in the process, in this external dialogue. And again, any tool that I commend to you has got to be something which encourages you to do that and reminds you continually that this is not an optional ingredient, the external dialogue. It's very much a key ingredient. And so self-doubt, lack of confidence, testing assumptions, setting goals, these are not things that, in broad terms, you're really made aware of, or you're engaging in that type of process when you're at university, or at least most of us didn't. I certainly didn't. But some of you probably would have CVs that I would die to have, or have at your age and stage. You've done lots of things you've planned and achieved. In other words, I'm probably preaching it and converted in that case. But in the law firm environment, you've got to think about, how is it that your career can be progressed in conjunction with those that you're working with? And if that doesn't prove to be the case, then where might you think about moving next? Because it's a sad reality, that perhaps it's a good reality, that in the past there was a premium paid for loyalty. If you move too many times, you'll look down on. These days, people don't tend to hang around perhaps as long as they used to, and that's no bad thing. If the aims of your organisation, the people that you work with, are not likely to support the ambitions that you have, that the efforts you need to make, then it's only fair that you do move on. And it's only fair, quite frankly, that if you're in the position, as I have been on many occasions, having to counsel people in that role, that they take the step to move, or at least to start on a planning process which might at some stage enable them to move, rather than to sit there. And as I found in some cases when I've been called in to consult, they say to me, look, Duncan, this chap has been with me for 10 years and he's never really done a really good thing for himself. Can you please mentor him or coach him? But really what they meant is, can you please persuade him to move out of the organisation? This is something that in reality should have been done 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. It's very unfair to leave somebody in that role if in fact they are not making progress, and they're not making progress in your environment. And I've seen many cases where people who have moved have been so much better off in a new environment than in the old. Many, many reasons for that. Every case is different, but it's not something you should shy away from. And the sooner you engage in a formal planning process, as it were, and engage in that internal dialogue and face your own inner demons insofar as you have them, and learn the practice, the sooner you work out what you really want to do in life. It's very hard to learn without stretching your capabilities. The Navy SEALs, allegedly, according to American TV, which we all watch far too much of, have this rule that by the time the Navy SEALs have finished with you in their commando training course, they reckon you're up to about 40% of your capability, and that the other 60% only comes when you really think it's well beyond the line. In other words, most of our capabilities and ambitions have never been tested. We've never really put them to the test. We've never really driven ourselves. We've never really had those very difficult conversations. Sure, you can think of a few occasions when you have, and you probably still remember them at 5 a.m. in the morning and think about what you could have said, or where you could have been, or what you might have done. But we don't do it frequently enough. We don't test ourselves often enough, and we certainly don't document the process, because that in the end is really where the rubber hits the road. You look back at what you were doing, what you were planning, what you said you were going to achieve. Did you do it? Did you try? In many, many cases, as I said, I go to firms, quite often lots of plans. I mean, many cases, no plans whatsoever. It's even worse, but they've got an idea in their head. And this is a classic situation where I used to have partners who would have perhaps one or two ideas about how they'd grow their practice. And 5 years later, they'd still be telling me about the same idea. And I'd still be asking the same question, somewhat uncharitably, about what they'd actually done about it. And they never wanted to put the idea to the test. They didn't want to put themselves to the test. They didn't want to nail the objective up on the door and give it a college try and admit if it didn't work that they had failed and they should move on to something else. They held this as sort of something in the back of their mind that one day perhaps it might work, and there wasn't enough money, or there wasn't enough time, or they didn't get enough assistance. A million excuses. Let me tell you one other thing I used to find. Those types of partners would often come to me and say, okay, well, now you've twisted my arm, you're threatening me with all sorts of dire consequences if I don't get on and do this sort of thing. And I'd say, okay, here's $5,000, here's $10,000. Now go off and do it. And don't tell me that I'm not prepared to give you the budget, because here it is. And time after time, I would find that the budget had not been expended. One of the worst problems I had in allocating monies to teams and individuals was their lack of willingness to spend the money. No matter how well advised their activities might have been, they just didn't want to try in a meaningful way and find something in the way of feedback or in an outcome that they couldn't live with, because they thought, well, they had one idea, what if that failed? And of course, that's another fear we have, that ideas won't recur, that you won't find out, that you won't come up with a new idea. And let me assure you that planning as a process is one where, having done it a few times, you'll have more ideas than you ever thought you possibly could have. And you'll get those ideas because you will have poked the universe, you'll have poked the client, you'll have poked the opportunity, and you will have got some feedback, and you'll have found out what works and what doesn't. And in the process, you'll have learned a lot about yourself and about the market. So let's look at the summary of where we are at the moment, because I just want to pause here before we get into the mechanics of the tool itself and emphasize these points, that it's a process involving internal and external dialogue. It's a process of learning by doing, by actually doing it. And that's what the startup environment's all about. People who endlessly plan and never step outside the office, as one noted commentator says, who don't actually put the plans to the test, are not going to learn very much. They're certainly not going to learn. They're perfectionists. They want to get everything absolutely right before they step out and load the website, package the product, offer it for sale. Too little, too late. You might need to change well before that. No different for lawyers, no different for those good ideas that you might have about a new service or a new product, as it were. The sooner you get out there, give it the college try, the sooner you get the feedback you need. If you're not prepared to do that, then you're not serious about actually trying anything new, let alone trying to change the current environment in which you're working. So learning by doing. Learning to set the right goals. Many of us will engage in quite unrealistic planning. Nothing quicker to cure you of that than to try and execute on an unrealistic goal. We've all had them. We've all done it. I hope some of you have done it. To join the particular team, to go on a particular trip, to strike up a conversation with someone who might appear attractive from either sex, as it were. But unless you've done it, you won't learn. You won't learn that it's a reasonable goal, that it's within your capabilities, that you have the resources. Next point is that you need to have multiple perspectives on goals. Too many of us tend to characterize goals in one way. We'll think about it in a financial perspective, or a resources perspective, or a time-based perspective, but we won't often consider multiple perspectives. What I'm going to do is take you through those perspectives using this tool, because I think it's not something that instinctively you would do unless driven to by the planning process that I'm commending to you. Persistence, execution, and building resilience. Well, I've covered those, I think, pretty well. So I'm going to pause for a minute now in the sense of inviting you to remember that quote of Winston's about the process of planning. I hope I've driven that nail home particularly hard, rather than you being concerned, as often you will hear. It extends into budget deliberations. It extends right across the spectrum in law firms. You'll get the naysayers sitting at the back of the room, heckling you on the basis that it doesn't matter what we put down on paper, what we project we might be doing next year, it won't work, it can't work, it didn't work last time, and it won't work this time. That is just so common. You've all experienced it, but that means that you don't even try and you don't learn. And unless you're prepared to learn, your next attempt has got no better chance of success than your first attempt. I often used to think that one of the reasons that I was elected to be a managing partner on a number of occasions was that at least I was prepared to give it a go. And if I fell on my face, as I did on several occasions, in places as far afield as Hong Kong, China, the Middle East, and in Brussels, I remember very unfavourably. But even the naysayers would say, well, at least he tried, at least he gave it a go, he came back, he said, that didn't work, it was a rotten idea, and we'll move on to something else. And that's not a bad reputation to have, because if you're leading in a firm environment, if you're a team leader or you aspire to be a partner, then you've got to have that degree of capability for your own welfare as well as for the people that you're working with. Most people like to have a vision, a direction pointed out to them, quite happy to engage with you, usually, providing you follow through, you show persistence and committal. If all you do is endlessly toss the ball back or toss it in the air, not many people will follow you in that environment. So I do commend the process in that sense. So let's move on. I'm going to look now at some of the wording I used in the registration stuff about unlocking your career. And I'm going to look at it from the point of view of if you're an employee in an organisation, or in the event that you're a solo practitioner or a team leader in a larger firm. First of all, let's look at the employee situation. And a lot of employees would say to me, look, it's no point me planning my objectives. My partner won't agree, or the managing partner's, he's terrible, he's going to squash it. Quite the wrong attitude, in the sense that a number of commentators talk about the 4 C's these days. What is it that they're looking for in the employee space? And what they're looking for is someone who's prepared to collaborate, someone who's prepared to be creative in their solutions and their attitude towards work and clients, someone who's prepared to connect, and somebody who's prepared to contribute. So you've got collaborate, create, connect, and contribute. They're the attributes that we're repeatedly told are what employers are looking for. And from my perspective, I couldn't agree more. There's nothing worse than an audience of people who are not prepared to engage, who aren't prepared to step outside their safe zone. Because at the end of the day, I nor anybody else has all the answers. As I say, it's a team sport. You need collaborators, you need enthusiasts, you need people who are prepared to step towards the edge. I'm not suggesting necessarily that you adopt the view commended by one innovator that I spoke to in Silicon Valley, who said that one of the problems with being an entrepreneur was that he was the only idiot who was prepared to run over the cliff and work out a business plan before he hit the ground. That is pretty gutsy. It's an extreme view, but if you're in the high-tech and high-change environment, you might need to be that gung-ho. I don't think law's quite in that space yet, but the principle is pretty much the same. Every now and again, you've got to step out of your comfort zone in a serious way and give it a try. After all, the practice of the law is still reasonably profitable. If you look at the profit margins of many of the professions, they're a lot worse than the legal profession. We all got very high expectations, but our failure to invest in areas such as planning really works very much to our detriment. If we're not prepared to plan, then processes like online delivery of documents, artificial intelligence, global forces that where cheaper resources can be accessed from anywhere in the world are going to come as a very rude shock to many of us, and the traditional profit margins will be eroded. So you need to be able to think about those things. Certainly You might look at me and say, well, it's not going to worry Duncan too much. He's at an age and stage where he's going to bow out gracefully one of these days. But I can see it all over the world. That anxiety level is rising, and appropriately so. There's no reason why the lawyers can't be at the forefront of that change rather than be victims of it. So, if you're an employee, some decisions are made for you, we know that, but the question of alignment between your goals and your employer's goals are paramount. In other words, you've got to work out what that alignment might look like. What are the goals that the employer is setting for you? You need to have that discussion with the employer. That's part of the external dialogue. You need to make sure that you are on the right page, and that whilst you may not share those goals necessarily, you need to know what they are. You need to know whether you're going to fit into that environment, whether you can contribute and collaborate in achieving those aims. If you can't, maybe you're in the wrong place. But having had the dialogue, you can help make that decision. You need, therefore, to be able to meet the employer's expectations. So you need to know what they are before you can do that. You need perhaps to establish what you've been doing and how you've been doing it for the purposes of satisfying some appraisal or review process. So many people don't even do the elementary planning required to provide, if you like, an audit trail, a personal audit trail to establish what they've done over the last 6 months or 3 months or whatever it happens to be, so that when the review occurs, they can have an intelligent discourse about what they've done and what they've tried to do. Now, hopefully, the beginning of an appraisal process, that is the day you walk into the place, those objectives are discussed and set and documented, and then you progress over the next 6 or 12 months, depending on how frequently the review takes place. And you've kept the detail in order to establish the track record. Again, more in the exception than the rule. Very seldom done. One elementary trick you might like to attempt, that I still don't see, although we've been doing it in some firms for the best part of 25 years, is creating time costing codes or costing codes which you can use to record non-billable but productive time. Now, we're all very good at recording what we do, whether we charge by the time or however else we charge. We do keep good records. If that's the skill you've got, keep a record of what you're doing in progressing your plan. Use the codes, use the narration, collect the data, open a file which doesn't go into the general file recording of the firm, but is just simply a personal file using the firm's systems, which enables you to record that non-billable, as we used to say, non-billable but productive. So write it down. What did you do? It's great going back over it 6 months later and, oh yes, I did do that, I did do that. This is what I did, this is what I tried. Very seldom done. People don't like doing. And establishing a reputation for executing on goals. Now, they may not be your own goals, they might be set for you, but the ability to execute is critical. Learning by doing and measuring. Measuring is an important ability. You know, if the goals being set by your employer are not clear enough, you've got to ask for clarity. You've got to drive the conversation to a point where saying, well, now I know you want me to increase my billings, but by how much, and where do you think that work might come from, or what resources are you prepared to set aside? What time investment are you prepared to make in order to enable me to secure that objective? Planning and business planning and marketing are as much about setting aside time in a realistic fashion as they are about being gung-ho about actually doing it. Too many practitioners follow the practice of saying, well, you know, planning and marketing and driving and creating a business and the systems to support it is something that I do after I've done my real work. Not good enough. If you've got an employer who's expecting big things and change, then is he prepared to give you, say, half a day a week? Is he prepared to work with you for 2 hours a week? Set aside a time budget. Now, again, the tool that we'll be talking about in a minute does encourage you to have exactly that discussion. So this is not something that we're just discussing and then passing on. And utilising a coach or mentor. Too many firms, they might do a bit of internal mentoring from time to time. Sometimes it's just the review process. What's wrong with engaging someone from the outside? Many firms use me in that fashion, and I commend them for it, because it wasn't something that I grew up with, and I wish I'd had that experience in my early days. It's not that expensive, and it can really pay dividends, particularly at early stage in your career. So that's the employee's perspective. If we talk about the sole practitioner or partner or team leader, well, you can see from what I've said earlier, encourage you to set goals that will advance the practice, your practice, the people that you're expecting to assist you. Executing systematically, you need to be having those team meetings where you've got an agenda, where you've got a plan, you've discussed with the people that you work with, the team plan, maybe there's even a firm plan, but at least hopefully there's a team plan or a personal plan that you're working on, that the people you're delegating the work to are part of the story. They're part of the resources that you need to execute. Don't have that, chances of using them intelligently, not too good. So again, the need to focus on multiple perspectives comes up. Again, we'll look at that in more detail in a moment, but what I'm saying here is many plans lack those multiple perspectives, particularly if you're in management roles. It's not just a marketing plan, for instance. You need to think about the objectives you're trying to achieve from, I suggest, some 4 different perspectives in order to decide how it is that you're going to go about achieving that goal. We'll go into that in more detail in a moment. Delegation, of course, critical skill to have, and the skill that's most lacking in most practitioners, the lack of ability to delegate. Why? Quite often because of the lack of ability to plan and engage those around them. Well, if you don't have a plan, you don't know what you're going to delegate, if it's all coming back to you, not surprisingly, it's very hard for you to make larger than average profits without an ability to delegate. It doesn't have to be to an employee, it could be an outside resource, but you've got to work out, and you can only work it out by giving it some thought in advance. What does the task involve? What are you going to do that you can meaningfully contribute? And what is it that you should be delegating? Too many practitioners, even in large firms, operate as solo practitioners because they won't delegate. What happens? They get very quickly sidelined by the practitioner who does delegate, who builds a team and who far outstrips his comparator in profitability, if that's your only measure. But quite frankly, it's a lot better fun working with others, achieving mutual goals, seeing the younger practitioners coming up and working with you and helping you service those clients that you've spent so much time. That ability to delegate, to create what we call leverage, is still a critical ingredient in driving unusually high profitability in firms. And it doesn't have to be a model where you're driving a slave train, as it were. Far from it. Your ability to engage, to envisage and create a career path for younger practitioners, to delegate, to set appropriate goals, all should be part of this planning regime that I'm advocating. And again, using a coach or a mentor. Again, you get to a point in an organisation quite often where I'm asked to come in and actually coach the team leader, because the team leader hasn't had the background or discipline or knowledge to understand that now he's risen to that point or she's risen to that point. Suddenly they're responsible for a group and they don't know how to do it. And it can be a very short process, 3 months, something like that, make a real difference in somebody's career once they realise the basics of managing a team, as opposed to simply taking one over and then wondering what on earth you do next. Big step for a lot of people, and one that requires a good deal of thought, because you don't often get a chance to do it 2 or 3 times. You fail in that role in one firm, you're almost certainly going to have to move firms and try it again. Pretty expensive, pretty demeaning, pretty disheartening. Can be done, often is done, but there are easier courses to follow. So we're getting to the rub, as it were, the tool the tool that you use should enable you to set realistic and achievable goals, should engage these multiple perspectives I've been talking about, should enable you to allocate resources and time appropriately, should encourage you to review the whole exercise as a process, invite that external dialogue that I've been talking about, provide measurable outcomes. So it's not too vague. You want to know when you succeed and when you've failed. And if it's too woolly, you're never going to know. An audit trail, I talked about that already, and encourages experimentation, self-learning, and growth. Now that is not a skill that I can underestimate to lack in promoting to you. That skill is something that you only learn by trying and trying and trying again. You can't learn it from a book. You can't learn enough about yourself from a book. You can learn about the process, which I'm talking about now, but until you put it into practice, you simply can't learn fast enough. Those that try and fail, try and fail, try and fail, try and succeed, then another failure, then another success, they build that muscle. That's what I'm encouraging. So the tool, the so-called balanced scorecard. A couple of academics, Kaplan and Norton. I first came across this tool working with Toyota in Melbourne. Amazed at how well they implemented it across an industrial environment. The guts of this, however, and I invite you to research it and to look at the books, and there's field books, there's handbooks, there's an enormous amount of literature about this process, but there are some things that I find are just so useful in the legal environment that I can't commend them too highly to you. Essentially, it involves the notion that you have a goal, that the goal is viewed from 4 different perspectives, and that in not only setting this goal, but executing it, you consider each of these perspectives in turn so that you make sure that you cover all of the aspects that are essential to the realization of this goal. And you might think, well, why is that so necessary? Well, I can tell you that these terms, these various perspectives are so broad that there's almost nothing that I can think of, and I challenge people at many of the seminars I've given in past years to think about a topic or a task that doesn't fall within one of these grab bags, as it were, in setting plans that isn't useful in considering A, whether this is a worthwhile goal, and B, how you execute. So how does it work in practice? And some of you will have read ahead and seen in the handout exactly what I mean, but let's look at a couple of examples, because it's only in that area that you'll actually see how it works. So the first thing is to use quarterly sheets, quarterly objectives. Now you can do this on the computer, you can do it in hard copy. I've done it in both. It's quite possible, no real difficulties doing this, but let's look at the way you document it to start with. 1 sheet for each goal, okay? So the goal is written up here in the top left-hand corner. On the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see the 4 different perspectives that I've been talking about, the financial tasks that are involved in achieving this goal, the client-related tasks, the learning and development tasks, and the process and systems tasks. We'll talk about what those categories mean in a minute. And on the right-hand side here, across this axis, you've got the key tasks to achieve the goal, the timeline that you've got in mind, the resources that are required, and how you're going to measure success. And this discipline of filling in these squares, simple as it might seem, is the essential success gauge for this type of process. So let's have a look at one that actually bears some resemblance to a task that I did recently with a client. Firstly, the task up here was growing inbound business from China. Okay, so they were a group of lawyers. They were in the Melbourne environment. They wanted to increase business from China. Okay, pretty broad topic actually, perhaps a bit wider than I'd normally recommend, but that was the broad topic they were after. So that we looked at it from the 4 different perspectives, and we thought, well, from a financial point of view, what are we talking about? We're talking about setting a marketing budget to help us drive that business, because we don't think we can do that without a marketing budget. So we need to get some idea about what that might be and what extent of that dollar might be. We thought that it might take about 3 months to get that done and arranged and in place. We thought we might need, say, $5,000 initially just to test the water, to get something moving quickly. And the measure of success in this case was to actually spend the money. I've told you about that before, that allocation of money doesn't mean to say that people actually spend it, but that was one of the key indicators. If we spent the money and there was an audit trail, then we could evaluate whether or not those particular marketing issues had been successful and whether we'd spent the money. Next one, client-related tasks. Well, because this is essentially a client-related topic, not surprisingly, there were a lot of those topics to think about. Contacting Chinese immigration agents, looking at the real estate agents that were dealing in property in the immediate vicinity of this client and with their existing client base, looking at the recent influx of Chinese banks into Australia, looking at existing clients with Chinese connections, looking at the Chinese-Australian Business Chamber, and even considering an exploratory visit to China to see what the prospects were up there of joining perhaps with a Chinese firm, or maybe a larger firm up there that didn't have an Australian connection. Lots of different things there that were on the list. Now, it's not to say all those were going to be achieved within a quarter. And I did say this was a quarterly plan, and that's quite significant, because if you make it a 12-month plan, in my experience, everything gets put off to about the 10th month and nothing gets done really in the intervening period. So if you make it a 12-week review and you set your objectives on a 12-week schedule, things happen, or don't, let's be honest, in a pretty quick time frame. And if you can't kick off a major idea and a major project of this nature within that time frame, it ain't going to happen. So you need to go to different people, you know, change the people or change the people. So get it down, get it documented. These issues will usually take longer than the 3 months, and I've written 3 months plus here. We might need a marketing analyst to help us thinking about what some of these opportunities might look like. And we've set ourselves as a measurable target 10 or 15 client visits and perhaps 2 seminars that we're going to hold in order to test the water, as it were. Again, some tangible objectives within that 12-week period, and some others that are going to take longer. And in your next quarterly review, you'd roll this plan over and you'd assess how well you'd gone on these objectives and amend these targets accordingly. So we've looked at financial issues, we've looked at client-related tasks, and I might say that in the financial task, you might have set some objectives about the dollar value of what work you were trying to attract. There are lots of things. We'll talk about what some of those features might be from these various perspectives in due course, but in this case, we were looking mainly at a marketing budget. The third one, the learning and development tasks, much ignored in planning processes. In other words, have you got the skill base to do the work that you want to attract? You know, we're going to go for BHP, we're going to go for the top end of town. Well, have you got the lawyers to do it? Have you got the systems? Do you know the people that you'd have to approach? Chances are you might have to learn about them. In this case, we identified Chinese language classes for some of the people involved, and even hiring Chinese talented lawyers as an objective in order to start this sort of process off. And many firms have done this now, not surprisingly, but it's got challenges. It's not easy. Finally, processes and systems tasks. Again, you know, have you got Chinese, interpreted documents? They need to be interpreted properly. They need to be translated. They don't want to be a translation that's done by somebody's best friend necessarily. You want a good qualified translator. The first thing a Chinese client will do will be read your Chinese documentation and literally laugh if they find it amusing. In the same way we laugh about Chinglish or Japlish, you know, it's very amusing to see a poor translation. So think about those type of things. And again, in each one of these cases, we've got a timeline, we've got the resources that we think we might need, and we've got a measure of success. And if you're attempting to encourage a team to embark on this, these are the sorts of factors you've got to have down. Now, it's not to say you're going to get it all into these little boxes, but you get the idea. There might be a page behind that box, there might be a page behind this box. But the high-end plan is going to look something like this, so that you can, when you have the team meeting and this is one of the objectives, or you're meeting with your employer and this is an objective he's set, this is the plan you're working on. Where have you gone on this issue? What do you need? What resources? What time? What's the problem? How are you going? Has this happened? You can see the dialogue that occurs straight away. You get a bit of the idea about how it works. So let's have a look at a second example. This one, again, a very broad topic, increased profitability. Now, this is all about financial issues. So in the financial perspective, you've got to think about, well, what are the key tasks that you need to achieve increased profitability? You need to think about what makes your business profitable. Well, in this case, I've identified that the firm needed to increase its leverage from a sort of one-on-one situation where they were mainly partners to having at least a 1-on-2 ratio to increase profitability. We needed to review pricing agreements, cost agreements, and how we charged and what clients were meeting what part of the profit profile currently. Pretty obvious stuff, but you know, you do need to think about it. How long was it going to take to revise the cost agreements, to hire additional people, 3 months for one target, 4 weeks for another? We might need a recruitment expertise. We might need, this is an objective in the end, perhaps a longer term objective, a 1-to-3 ratio. And perhaps we're looking at reducing our headcount because we had too many Indians and not enough chiefs. You can see what I mean. The various categories of target that fall within the financial perspective that needs to be drawn on this particular task of increasing profitability. Looking at client-related perspectives, again, much understated and unrecognised when you're talking about profitability. Are you working for the right people? Do you have too many clients that cause you 80% of the problems and provide only 20% of the profit? You need to work out which of those profitable clients are. You need to do that in a time scale. You might need to hire some additional help to get it done. And you're going to promulgate or target specific types of work or particular profiles of clients. And because those tasks may well generate more profit for you than what we've identified up here in the top line. But in combination, a lot more powerful. Learning and development tasks may well be that the staff don't understand how to use the cost agreements. They don't estimate costs very accurately. They need some additional education. You might need to get a cost expert in to review what it is that you do, and you're going to measure that particular outcome by the number of lectures that maybe you've held and a revision of the agreements that you've talked about. And the processes and systems, again, much ignored. You know, do you have frequent billing? Do you have the appropriate IT? You know, do you need to think about outsourcing? You know, maybe some of these activities could be done by somebody else, not always internally. And again, timelines, resources, and measures of success. Now, none of that's rocket science. It's, you know, if any one of you sat down and thought about this, you'd come up with exactly a list like this. But so often, the headline task is outlined by the leadership, but the underlying structure is not there. If you advance on all these fronts, then chances are the objective may well be achieved. If you simply look at any one of these, and that's all you do, very small chance of success. So the process is important, the timeline is important, the measuring of the outcomes is important, as is the idea that this is a quarterly plan, quarterly. So on day one, after you've decided this is the goal that you want to pursue and you're prepared to commit these resources, because how often have we seen a plan where no resources are allocated, no money's made available, no time is appropriated, nobody's given authority to get the required consultancy? Now, if that's the case, you're not serious about it. So immediately this goal disappears. But at least we've explored it intelligently and we've decided that it's beyond our means or ability. That's a very important thing to do. So let's just keep going, because some people get stuck with what these perspectives might be depending on what the nature of the goal is. And what I've done here is just identify, particularly in financial perspective, the sorts of things that you might be thinking about. Lock-up, WIP, debtors, profit contribution level. There's a whole galaxy of issues there. Most of us are pretty familiar with that. If we look at growth and learning perspectives, you get things like marketing skills, conferences, self-development courses, technical education. Again, we're all familiar with that, but you do need to think about it. Any task that you want to achieve, have you got the skills? Do you need to uplift the skills? Do you need to hire in new skills, new resources? Don't do that, chances of success that much smaller. Client perspective. Some of us are better at this than others, but again, what I normally find is that, you know, whatever the target client is, whatever industry they operate in, there's a lack of knowledge about how that industry works, who are the major players in that industry, where the work's likely to come from, what the trends are in that industry. And so in a lot of cases, you need client intelligence. You need to actually engage in that conversation with industry experts, perhaps with accountants who work in the area, financial advisors, people who work with those clients in order to find out just how the business model works. If you don't have that inside knowledge, the chances of you actually making an impact without background understanding, very small indeed. So what is it, for instance, going back to that China's example, what's the motivation behind the wealthier Chinese coming to Australia? I could write a book about that, because there are many different motivations, but you need to zone in on what it is that you think you could contribute to a certain segment of that population, because there is an opportunity and many are exploiting it. And from a systems perspective, again, much undervalued. You know, particularly if you're an employee, you know how the systems work or don't work within the organisation, the workflow, the precedent base, the people that you recruited, how you're onboarded, how they're inducted, what the appraisal and mentoring process is, and all that type of background, key ingredients. So whatever the objective is, think about it from an L&D perspective, think about what you might need to change before you press the go button on that particular goal. If you haven't thought about it, then this whereas the whole operation may fall down despite everything else going tickety-poo. I've seen on several occasions where major clients have been attracted to a firm, they've got the opportunity, they've got in the door, when they try to produce the work, they can't meet the expectations of the client, they lose the client, and they're not going to get another chance this side of the next 5 years to make another approach in a lot of cases. So if you've done all the homework, make sure you can execute. And this is where this is so important, particularly when you're dealing with the larger corporate clients. So we can keep going because I'm conscious of the time, but you recall I've talked about understanding the goals that you're setting for yourself, not finally saying that is an appropriate goal before you've considered it from the 4 different perspectives. Document those perspectives, sit back, think about, well, now, is that all doable? And if so, in what time frame? If you've got to negotiate with your team, with your firm, with your partners, with somebody else who you might get in a joint venture, which is what we used to do a lot of, joint ventures between clients and the firm, joint ventures between yourself and the local land agent, with the latest immigration agent. What is it that you need to put together to show them, to have that external dialogue, let alone to motivate your own team? All those are key ingredients. So the payoffs for employees, you get that alignment with your employer, you get those resources and what have you put into place. You know, how many times do you see the budget exercise being carried out by the partners before the 30th of June? Various projects should be put up for their consideration. You've got a plan, you can put it up to your partner, get the budget allocation, suddenly you're off and running. But if you're leaving until July, chances are, I know the budget's been set, we put that in the budget, then our profit's going to decline, no matter how meritorious you've missed the boat. So think about when it might be useful to begin some of this planning process, usually well before the budget is crystallised, so you can get the thought into the partner's head, or if you're the partner, to convince your fellow partners to set aside. You haven't got infinite resources, but you do need to recognise that these things cost time and money, so commit them publicly, and do it through a planning process. Employee benefits are pretty clear and very much appreciated if you come to a partner or a managing partner with a plan, you've thought it through. May not be perfect, but at least you've given it a good old college try before you put your hand up for an extra 10 grand or whatever it might be. For the solo partner or leader, again, pretty obvious benefits, but this business about refining your strategy, your overall goals, so dependent upon trying some of these experiments, planning them, failing and succeeding, and managing that success or failure appropriately, and being able to teach that discipline to those that you work with is an invaluable lesson. People appreciate it. The more informed employees, when they come to a firm, as well, saying how are they going to learn, who are they going to learn from, and are they going to learn these type of skills? It's nice being cross-examined by an ambitious employee or potential employee, because they are asking the right questions in that regard. So tips and traps as we roll towards the conclusion. Too many goals. I would suggest, if you haven't done this before, perhaps 1 or 2 goals for the initial quarter rather than 3 or 4. Get used to the process of asking those questions I've said about the tasks and the timelines and the measurabilities. Try and execute on that. Learn about the process. It's a habit you're having to encourage yourself to adopt. Habits are notoriously difficult to put in place. Make it as simple as you can to increase the chances of success. So 1 hairy, audacious goal is better than 5 pretty sloppy ones. Don't make them too complex or ambitious. Something like becoming a partner is not really useful. There are probably 5 or 6 steps that need to be considered. Break the task down. Discuss it with as many people as you can. If you can't convince the people around you that it's a reasonable task, chances are that it may not fly. So get it out on the table as quickly as you can. Diarise time. Set time aside in your calendar. Where you put the appointments with your clients, you set aside time when you're going to review this plan. Might be every Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock. It might be Tuesday morning or whatever, but set aside some time. Strike out an hour and keep to it. Keep to it religiously, particularly when it comes to the end of the 12-week cycle and you're having to review the process, because that takes a little bit longer. And try and organise the data that you're collecting in order to be able to review it. You might use Dropbox like I do. You might use a hard copy series of folders, but keep it organised so you can go back and learn from what you've done and what you haven't done and how well you've succeeded. And as I've said, it's a habit. It's difficult to integrate and maintain, but you need to get the help. Get as much help as you can. Be upfront, be public about it, ask the questions, ask for assistance, ask for resources, but above all, show an honest effort to actually implement and execute, because that will impress more than anybody else. So what I normally find, just to complete what I call the offer section of this particular webinar, is that there are a few sort of standard approaches, let me put it this way, as to how one does this, what I see and what I'm asked to do in setting quarterly goals. Normally, in setting a quarterly series of goals for any individual, whether they be an employee or a team leader or a managing partner, whatever role they have, it takes about 3 or 4 hours to do that. And normally you're talking about fees of around $1,500 odd bucks to do it. You're talking about checking in with those people on a monthly basis in order to see what the progress is and to keep them honest, as it were, and to give them ideas and feedback and to check the progress as against the plan. So there's another $1,500 odd involved in that time. And then there's the end of the quarter, you're having a comprehensive review to see how you've gone and setting your goals for the next quarter, and you're rolling them over on that way to make an annual effort, as it were, on perhaps 1 or 2 goals initially and then 3 or 4. So it becomes progressively more complex. So it's quite often that I find that the initial planning process takes about $5,000 worth of fees and about 10 hours on my part to actually execute. It varies, but that's basically what it takes. And in this particular webinar, what I want to do is suggest that I'll do that for something like a 20% discount. In other words, if you're prepared to take on this task, if you're going to need assistance to set these objectives, to review them, and I do recommend it because it is difficult. You do need advice, better get some advice from somebody who's actually been in the game and knows what's going on and it can offer meaningful advice. And on that basis, I think the end cost to you would be somewhere around about $3,600, which is a 20% discount on what I normally do. And checkups can be done via Skype to save even more. In that case, it can be as little as $3,000. But that's the sort of expense that's needed. That's the time commitment that I expect. If you can't do that, then I don't think you're really serious about planning. Of course, it can be done internally. Of course, it can be done with other people. Just giving you an idea about what sort of cost basis I work from and what I find people need in order to give this a real push. And I think that in many cases, it's that initial push that's required. Thereafter, after 3 or 6 months, you find you can do this yourself. You understand the process. But without that, it becomes extremely difficult. So I'll stop there, knowing what the time is, and invite any questions that might be forefront of your mind. As I say, in the event that time's against you, as it might be, and you want to contact me afterwards, please feel free to do so. I'll circulate that offer in writing formally to all of you immediately after the webinar. And for those that might want to review some of the points that were made in this webinar, there will be a replay available on YouTube. And again, I'll communicate that to you. And in the event that you have any difficulty either with the offer or with the YouTube replay, just get in contact with me. I had a few issues on my last webinar dealing with the uniform law, and I had to rebadge it for the purposes of YouTube in order for people to watch it again, but it's all been captured, the slides, the works, so you have no difficulty reviewing all or any of it at a later time should you so wish. So thanks for taking the time to engage, and as I say, I'll stay online now, end the formal broadcast, but stay online so that if anybody wants to chat, they can use the chat section to ask questions, and we'll take it up from there. So thanks once again, and I'll let you know when I've got another webinar coming up, and hopefully it'll be a topic that's as important as I think this one is. Cheers. So just